I moved into the Mayfair Towers in early September, right before the city started to turn cold. I'd just landed a new job downtown, and finally, I could afford a nice apartment on my own. The building itself was a relic from another time, old brick on the outside, wrought iron balconies, and an interior that combined charm with mystery. As I stepped into the lobby for the first time, I couldn't help but notice that almost everything had a story. But none of the decorations or old photographs hinted at the oddities I'd soon encounter. I rented a unit on the 12th floor, room 1204. It wasn't enormous, but it was clean, warm, and promised a fresh start after years of cramped, shared living. I spent my first few days settling in, unpacking boxes, hanging my favorite pictures, and trying to ignore the building's creaks and groans as it woke up each morning. Everything appeared normal. Or so I believed. The strange happenings began on a rainy night. I was home late, tired from a long day at work, and half listening to the distant rumble of thunder outside my window. I remember sitting on the couch with a book in hand when I heard the faint clunk of the elevator brake somewhere in the hall. It wasn't unusual for the elevator to stop occasionally. After all, Mayfair Towers was an old building with an aging lift. But this time, something felt off. I stared out into the dark hallway, trying to figure out if it was just my imagination. The sound repeated, a slow, almost methodical stopping and starting, and it set my nerves on edge. In the following days, I began to notice inconsistencies with the elevator. I'd press the button for the 12th floor, the elevator would shudder to life, and then on its digital display, I'd see floors listed out of order, 10, 11, 12, and then the next number wasn't 14, it was 13. My building, like many others, skipped the number 13, courtesy of superstition. I had never given it much thought. But here, on the digital panel, was a shining 13 button that had never been there before. One night, after a stressful day and with a jar of leftover coffee in hand, I decided to press it. I wasn't sure why. I suppose curiosity was a strong motivator after all. When I pressed 13, the elevator started moving. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a glitch. But then, as the numbers ticked up, I started to notice that something was different. The interior lights dimmed, and the gentle hum of the machinery took on an eerie tone. By the time we reached what should have been the hidden floor, the elevator shuddered to a stop, and the door slid open with a low hiss. What I saw immediately on the 13th floor made my heart pound in my ears. The hallway was identical in layout to the others, yet everything was tinted with a deep, unsettling red. The carpet, which I'd come to associate with reliability and familiarity, now seemed like a stain of blood, and the walls, usually a soothing cream, had a faint, almost imperceptible scorch mark along the base. Overhead, the lights flickered, casting jittery shadows that danced along the edges of my vision. I stepped back, feeling like I'd accidentally opened a door to a place that wasn't meant for me. Still, something compelled me to step out of the elevator. I walked cautiously down the hall. My shoes made soft thuds on the plush carpet as I neared a row of apartment doors. They looked similar to the ones on every other floor, plain, industrial numbers neatly printed on them. Except here, the door numbers were written in reverse. 401 was instead 104 and 402 was 204. I couldn't tell if it was a quirk of the building or something more sinister. One door, in particular, caught my attention. It was slightly ajar, and from the sliver of light escaping through the gap, I could see that it was empty. But then, just as I hesitated to fully peer inside, I saw a movement, a shadow, or maybe someone standing still in the darkness. My breath caught. I pressed my hand to my chest and took a step back, convinced my eyes were playing tricks on me in the gloom. The silence pressed in around me. I stood there frozen, with my heart pounding in my ears. Then, almost as quickly as it had appeared, the shadow vanished, leaving only the echo of its presence behind. I retreated to the elevator and practically pleaded with the buttons to take me back to the safety of 12. But as the doors closed on the ominous hallway, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me, a presence that thrived in that strange red-tinged corridor. Back in my apartment, I tried to ignore what had happened. I told myself it was my imagination, spurred on by too many late nights and stressful days. But over the next few nights, the building itself began to betray me. At first, it was the elevator. No matter which floor I pressed, the digital panel would occasionally flash the number 13 and give a soft, almost imperceptible beep. One night, while I waited for it at the lobby, I swear I saw the door flicker and then, just for a split second, the number 13 appear on the front before vanishing. I asked the security guard, an older man with a face as tired as his eyes, if he'd seen anything odd. He just shook his head and muttered about old wiring, dismissing my concern with a kind, if unconvincing, smile. Then came the nights when I heard footsteps. I was sure I was alone in my apartment, especially after locking the door before bed. But around 3 a.m., when the city was at its most silent, I began to hear shuffling sounds on the hallway outside my door. At first, I assumed it was just a neighbor pacing or the building settling. But the footsteps were too deliberate, too heavy. Sometimes I even caught a glimpse of a long, thin shadow moving past my window when I looked out. I told myself it was a trick of the light or a passing cab, anything but what it seemed. One particularly stormy night, when the wind howled like a wounded animal, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, ears straining in the dark. That's when I heard it clearly, a soft scraping sound, like fingernails dragging across the wooden floor of my hallway. I mustered every bit of courage, grabbed my phone, and tiptoed to the peephole. The corridor was dark, with only the occasional flicker of a malfunctioning light. All I could see was a long, indistinct shape standing in the middle of the hall. I froze, unable to look away. After what seemed like an eternity, the shape moved away, dissolving into the shadows as if it had never been there at all. I started researching the building's history the next day, unable to shake the feeling that there was a pattern behind all these occurrences. I visited the local public library and combed through old newspapers. I discovered that back in the 1980s, a tenant in Mayfair Towers had been involved in a grisly incident. There had been a massacre on what was then known as the 13th floor. The floor had been sealed off shortly after the incident, and in an effort to appease superstitions, subsequent floors were renumbered to avoid the ill-omened number. The details were murky, and the few survivors were too frightened to speak much about it. But the mention of a massacre and a secret floor sent chills down my spine. At work, I tried to act normal. But each night the building tormented me further. Sometimes, the elevator would stop at the 13th floor even when I hadn't pressed the button. One evening, I caught the elevator moving on its own, doors sliding open to reveal that same dark red corridor. I was alone inside, but I swear I could feel eyes on me, watching from an unseen vantage. The terror reached its peak one humid summer night. I was alone in my apartment, trying to concentrate on a project while the storm outside raged with unnatural fury. The power flickered, and I had to work by candlelight, a decision I soon regretted. The shadows danced around me, and every creak of the building sounded like a whisper. I kept glancing at the clock, waiting for the storm to pass, when suddenly, I heard the unmistakable sound of the front door creaking open. My heart almost stopped. I was sure I'd locked it securely. I grabbed a heavy flashlight and crept toward the sound, my pulse thundering in my ears. Slowly, I approached the living room and peered through the peephole. There, silhouetted by the erratic glow of the streetlight outside, was a figure standing in the entryway. The figure was incredibly still, but I could tell from the way it was angled that it wasn't human. It was too tall, and its limbs seemed a bit too long, as if stretching to unnaturally great lengths. It didn't move, didn't breathe visibly. Just stood there. I scrambled back, nearly tripping over a rug, and fumbled for my phone, dialing 911 in a trembling whisper. The operator's calm voice was a stark contrast to my panicked whispers, and within minutes, I was told help was on its way. But as minutes crawled by, the figure remained outside my door, and with every flash of lightning I got a glimpse of its face, a gaunt, expressionless face with eyes that held no kindness, only a distant, hungry intent. I barricaded my door as best I could with furniture and waited, every sound turning into a potential threat. I watched the hallway through a crack in the door, feeling completely isolated. After what felt like hours, the pounding eventually faded into silence. When the sirens finally wailed in the distance, I dared to unbar my door just enough to listen. There was no voice, no knock, just a heavy, eerie quiet. The police later told me they responded to a report of an intruder, but by the time they arrived, nothing was there. I never saw that figure again after that night, at least, not until later. Over the next few weeks, the events on the 13th floor escalated in subtle, relentless ways. I began to receive strange messages on my answering machine, distorted voices repeating single words over and over, "Come up now." In the dead of night, I'd sometimes wake to find muddy footprints outside my door that led nowhere. And always, every time I stepped into the elevator, that cursed 13 button would flash, beckoning me back. One particularly unsettling evening, I mustered up the courage to confront the mystery head-on. I decided to take the elevator intentionally to the 13th floor again. I pressed the button with shaking fingers. The elevator lurched into motion, the numbers climbed slowly, deliberately. As we reached 13, the doors parted like a dark maw, revealing that same bizarre, bloody red corridor. This time, I walked in, determined to find answers. I carried only a small flashlight and my overwhelming need to understand what was happening. The hall was even more oppressive than I remembered. The air felt colder, thicker. Every step I took on that strange carpet made me feel as if I were walking deeper into someone else's nightmare. I examined the door numbers closely. They were indeed written in reverse, and some of the numbers were smudged, as if written hastily or altered over time. I stopped in front of one door, its number reading 901 backwards on a tarnished plaque. When I pressed my hand to the cool metal, I almost expected it to vibrate with an otherworldly pulse. I moved from door to door slowly, as if in a trance. Most of them were locked, and I tried the handle only to find them sealed shut. However, one door was slightly open, again. I recalled the brief glimpse from weeks ago. With trepidation, I peered in, and I saw nothing but darkness. I hesitated, then forced myself to step inside. The room was empty, its windows covered by heavy, dusty drapes. On a wall hung a collection of old family photos, but in every photo the faces were scratched out. I ran my fingers over them, and the rough texture sent shivers through my body. Was this some kind of warning, or a record of all that had happened on this forbidden floor? Feeling unsettled, I retreated from the room. The moment I stepped back into the corridor, I heard a sound, a soft, slow creaking from behind me, as if a door was gently closing. I turned around, heart pounding, but saw nothing. I waited a long moment in the oppressive silence until I convinced myself that my mind was playing tricks on me. I left the 13th floor and returned to my apartment, hoping that staying away would make it all go away. For a brief period, life seemed to settle back into its normal rhythm. I tried to forget what I had seen, to treat it as a one-time glitch in an old building system. But the strange occurrences persisted. I began to notice an unsettling change in my own apartment. At times, I'd catch reflections in my mirror that weren't mine, ghostly images flitting behind me. A door would be closed one moment and slowly slide open the next, without explanation. I even woke up one morning to find muddy handprints on my walls, which I could not wash off. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford. Every night I lay awake, eyes wide, listening to the building's murmurs, waiting for that distant knock or the scrape of a silent intruder. The paranoia set in slowly, like a tight noose around my mind. I began to dread the quiet hours of the night, when every sound could be a harbinger of something terrible. Eventually, I decided I had to put an end to it. I contacted an old friend who was a historian and asked if he'd looked into the building's past. Over coffee in a dim diner off the beaten path, I recounted everything: the elevator that stopped on the 13th floor, the bizarre layout, the ghostly images, the relentless presence that haunted my nights. He nodded gravely and said, "You're not the first to be drawn to that floor." He explained that many residents over the years had reported disturbances, and though there were theories ranging from malfunctioning electronics to a malevolent spirit bound to the building, no one had ever been able to confirm anything. "It's like the floor has its own will," he said. "Once you step into that space, it changes you." His words resonated with me deeply. I began to feel as if the 13th floor had a gravitational pull, an unseen force that was slowly but surely drawing me into its tangled history. I started having vivid dreams about that corridor, a place where time stood still, where the faces in the photographs cried out for help, and where a faceless figure beckoned me deeper into darkness. One fateful night, after a particularly stormy evening during which the power had failed for nearly 2 hours, I was jolted awake by an urgent banging at my door. The sound was desperate, almost frantic. I peered through the peephole and, to my horror, saw the long, gaunt figure standing there. Its eyes, cold and luminous in the meager light, locked onto mine. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. When I finally mustered the courage to open the door, it vanished, leaving only a chill that seeped deep into my bones. That same night, I was unable to sleep. I sat on my couch, the hum of the city outside clashing with the silence of my apartment, thinking about what I had seen. It wasn't just a trick of the dim light or my imagination running wild, it was real. The presence on the 13th floor had reached into my life, and I knew it was only a matter of time before it would force its way in again. I decided I had to confront it once and for all. With a resolve born of desperation, I waited until the next stormy night to return to the elevator and press the button for the 13th floor deliberately. This time, I armed myself with more than a flashlight. I carried a small digital recorder, determined to capture any odd sounds or voices, hoping that documented evidence might help me piece together the mystery. The ride to the 13th floor was more torturous than before. Each floor passed felt longer than the last, as if the elevator was stuck in a slow-motion descent into the unknown. When I stepped out, the corridor was darker than I remembered, and the red glow seemed to pulse with life. I took a deep breath and moved forward, recorder in hand, determined to document whatever lay ahead. I walked the corridor slowly, every creak of the carpet and every whisper of the wind echoing in the silence. I approached one door marked 501 in reverse numbers. The recorder in my hand picked up a faint, almost imperceptible humming sound as I neared it. I pressed my ear against the cool metal door, hearing nothing but the steady beat of my own heart. Then I heard a low murmur, like a whispered conversation, coming from within. My pulse raced as I edged the door open a crack. Inside, the room was dimly lit by a single lamp that sat on a dusty table. It wasn't clear if the light was from the lamp or if it was a trick of the shadows, but all I could see were old, yellow letters scattered across a desk. I picked one up, my hands trembling. The letter was addressed to someone named Eleanor and was written in a hurried scrawl that spoke of terror, of voices in the walls, of things that watched from the corners, and of an unending dread that no prayer could banish. The last line read, "They're coming for me. I can't hide on the 13th floor." My stomach churned. I could feel the weight of those words, the despair of a soul trapped in a nightmare. As I left the room, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I hurried back down the corridor, recorder still running, until I reached the elevator. I pressed 12 and returned to the relative safety of my apartment, my mind swirling with questions and dread. What happened to Eleanor? Was she one of the many victims who had been ensnared by that cursed floor? And most disturbing of all, had I just invited that same fate upon myself? Back in room 1204, I barricaded my door, trying to convince myself that I was taking action rather than falling prey to paranoia. But as the nights wore on, the encounters grew more frequent. I kept hearing whispering voices when I closed my eyes, and sometimes, the shadows in my apartment would seem to stretch out, reaching toward me like grasping hands. I tried to ignore them, telling myself it was all a result of the stress and fear from my encounter on the 13th floor. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. One night, as I sat at my desk writing down everything I'd experienced, I noticed something odd on the computer screen. A single file had appeared on my desktop, a folder labeled simply 13. I didn't recall creating it. With trembling hands, I opened it and found dozens of old photos, scanned documents, and letters from previous tenants of Mayfair Towers. The documents detailed accounts of unexplained noises, missing time, and even hints of ritualistic practices on the forbidden floor. One photograph in particular made my blood run cold, a group of people standing in what looked like the corridor of the 13th floor, their eyes hollow and faces twisted in silent terror. I recognized one of the figures. It looked like the same gaunt entity I'd seen outside my door. Panic set in. I realized I was being drawn into something I couldn't explain, a legacy of terror that haunted every brick of this building. I contacted my friend again, urging him to research further. He told me that many of the documents pointed to a curse, some kind of ancient ritual that had been performed in secret by the building's original owners, a ritual meant to ward off misfortune but that went horribly wrong. The more I read, the more I felt as though I were piecing together a terrible puzzle, one that had been left for unsuspecting residents like me to complete. In the weeks that followed, my nights became a battle between sleep and wakefulness. I would drift in and out of restless slumber, constantly jolting awake as if from a bad dream. Always, I felt that presence lurking just at the edge of my vision. I began to dread even the sound of the elevator, which by now was a constant reminder of that cursed 13th floor. I would wait for the pulsing red glow on the display, heart pounding, knowing it meant I was being called back into the darkness. Then, one night, after an especially harrowing day, I returned to the 13th floor for what I hoped would be a final confrontation. Armed with a recorder, a small digital camera, and all the resolve I could muster, I pressed the button and let the elevator take me down into that strange realm. Once again, the red corridor greeted me like an unwelcome host. This time, I wasn't just a curious resident, I was a man on a desperate quest to uncover the truth, to break the curse if possible. I walked slowly, each step measured, toward a door that seemed to beckon me. Unlike before, I wasn't merely recording whispers or seeing fleeting shadows. I was beginning to notice shapes forming in the corners of the hallway, figures that looked like they belonged to the forgotten past. In one instance, I saw a child standing motionless, her eyes wide and filled with sorrow. In another, an older man in outdated clothing appeared and then melted into the darkness. Each of these figures carried an air of tragedy and doomed despair, as though they were prisoners of the floor's twisted reality. Approaching the beckoning door, I felt an irresistible pull. With one last deep breath, I stepped inside. The room was different from any I had seen before. It was a sort of parlor, filled with antiquated furniture covered in dust. A grand mirror hung on one wall, its surface clouded with time. In the reflection, I saw not only myself but several other faces, ghostly silhouettes that mingled with my own. One of those faces, pale and sorrowful, reached out as if pleading for help. A frisson ran down my spine. I knew then that the 13th floor wasn't simply a haunted extension of the building, but a repository of lost souls, trapped echoes of lives that had been drawn into a cycle of terror and despair. For a moment, I felt overwhelmed by their silent, desperate yearning. I vowed to do whatever it took to free them, even if it meant confronting whatever malevolent force orchestrated it all. I spent the next several hours combing through the room. I discovered an old journal tucked behind a cracked vase on a dusty side table. Its pages detailed the life of a former resident named Eleanor, a woman who had once lived on the 13th floor, whose life had been cut short by the mysterious events that plagued the building. Eleanor wrote of a curse, of dark rituals performed by people desperate to escape poverty and misfortune, and of a bargain made with something otherworldly. Her last entry ended abruptly, with a frantic scrawl that read, "They're coming for us." The curse, don't let it win. Reading her words, I felt a surge of determination. Eleanor had been trying to warn someone all along. I realized that the answer to breaking the curse might lie in understanding what had been done on that floor and somehow undoing it. I took the journal, along with a handful of documents I'd found on my computer, and returned to my apartment. I needed to analyze every detail, every clue that might lead me to an answer. In the following days, I became consumed by this quest. I scoured every resource I could find about ancient curses and rituals, spending hours in libraries and meeting with local historians. I pieced together fragments of folklore and urban legend, slowly realizing that Mayfair Towers was built on land rumored to have once been a site of ancient spiritual rituals. Somehow, the original owners had combined modern superstitions with older rites, inadvertently creating a portal for something sinister. As the puzzle began to form a clearer picture, I noticed that the disturbances in my life grew more intense. Every time I attempted to research, the power would flicker, phone lines would go dead, and the very air in my apartment would seem to thicken with dread. The 13th floor was no longer a part of the building, it had become a living, breathing entity that manipulated my reality. One night, as I sat hunched over my notes, the apartment plunged into darkness. The storm outside must have knocked out the power. I reached for my flashlight, and that's when I heard it, a persistent, rhythmic knocking, echoing from within the walls. It wasn't the sound of the storm, it was deliberate, like a countdown. I followed the noise to a spot on the wall that I'd previously assumed was nothing more than an old panel. With trembling fingers, I pried it open. Behind it, I discovered a hidden room, its small space filled with relics and photographs from decades ago. Among them was a faded newspaper clipping about the massacre on the 13th floor and a list of names that seemed to include several of the figures I had seen in my visions. The significance of it all began to sink in. The people in these documents were not random, they were the lost souls of the 13th floor, each one drawn into a legacy of horror, never to escape. I felt their presence, mournful and vengeful, and I knew that my only chance to free them was to confront the evil that bound them here. I gathered the journal, the photographs, and every scrap of evidence I could find, determined to piece together a solution from the darkness. Armed with my research and a newly found resolve, I returned one final time to the 13th floor. I knew that this was the moment of truth. The next time I pressed the button and the elevator carried me down to that surreal corridor, I wasn't just a frightened tenant, I was a man on a mission. I needed to make things right, both for the lost souls and for myself. The elevator ride felt like an eternity. The numbers glowed ominously in the dim light as the machine ascended, each pause stretching my nerves thinner than before. When I finally stepped out onto the cursed floor, I could almost feel the weight of every tragedy that had taken place there. The corridor was silent, as though holding its breath, waiting. This time, I went directly to the parlor where I had found Eleanor's journal. Standing in the middle of the room, I placed the journal on the dusty table and spoke aloud, my voice shaking but resolute. I know what you went through. I know the curse that has bound you all. I'm here to help. Please, show me how to end this. I wasn't sure if the words would stir anything, but the air seemed to quiver in response. The mirror on the wall caught my eye, and I saw the reflection of those sorrowful faces once again. This time, however, one of them, the pale figure of a young woman, stepped closer in the reflection. She mouthed silent words, pleading and full of despair, before fading away like mist. I took that as my cue. I spent the next several hours pacing back and forth in the room, cross-referencing Eleanor's notes with my own research, trying to decipher the dark incantation she had hinted at, a ritual to break the cycle. The instructions were cryptic: gather symbols, recite certain lines at the stroke of midnight, and relinquish what was taken from you. I couldn't be sure if I was interpreting correctly, but as the clock in my mind ticked toward midnight, I felt the presence of the 13th floor drawing near. When midnight arrived, the storm outside was at its peak, and a deep, rumbling thunder vibrated through the building. I stood in the center of the parlor, journal open before me, and began to recite the words that Eleanor had written in a frantic scrawl. My voice echoed in that confined space, mingling with the wind's howl and the distant booms of thunder. Every syllable felt like a lifeline to those trapped souls. As I neared the end of the incantation, the room grew ice-cold. The mirror's surface rippled as if it were a pool of water disturbed by a stone. I could feel the presence of something behind the glass, a force that was fighting back against my words. The lights flickered violently, and a piercing scream, human and inhuman all at once, ripped through the room. I staggered back, almost dropping the journal. The mirror shattered into 1,000 fragments, each sliver capturing a final, fleeting glimpse of those lost souls. For a heartbeat, everything was silent, and then the corridor outside erupted in chaos. The sound of shattering glass mixed with footsteps that weren't my own, and somewhere in that cacophony, I heard a whisper, "Thank you." I don't know exactly how long I stood there, frozen by equal parts relief and terror, but eventually, the storm subsided and the oppressive weight lifted. I returned to my apartment, every step feeling both like an escape and a farewell to the horrors of the 13th floor. In the days that followed, I slowly began to see changes. The strange occurrences lessened, the elevator no longer showed the ghostly 13, and the footsteps in the hallway receded into silence. I felt as if the building itself had exhaled a long-held breath, and for the first time in weeks, I slept without fear. It wasn't until much later, in the quiet hours of one mundane morning, that I found a small envelope slipped under my door. Inside was a single photograph, the same group of faces from the 13th floor corridor, with one extra name scrawled at the bottom, my name. I realized then that the curse might not be completely lifted. In trying to break its hold, I had become a part of its story. I was forever bound to that place, marked by the struggles of the past. And sometimes, when I catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, like a shadow too tall, or a light that doesn't belong, I remember the red corridor and know that the 13th floor isn't truly gone. Now, sitting here in my quiet apartment, I write these words as a warning. The building may appear normal to the untrained eye, but beneath its surface lie secrets and tragedies that refuse to be buried. I share my story so that you, if you ever find yourself in Mayfair Towers or any place where an elevator dares to reveal a forbidden floor, remember, some doors are not meant to be opened. And sometimes, a number is more than just a number, it is a gateway to a past that never rests. I learned that night that some mysteries are meant to be left alone, that our desire for answers can sometimes invite the very terror we seek to escape. And though the 13th floor is silent now, I know deep down that its presence lingers in every creak of the building, every flicker of a light in the dark. It has changed me, forever linking my fate with its own tragic legacy. Each time I hear a sudden noise or see a shape move in the gloom, I wonder if the souls I tried to free are still calling out for help, and if one day, they might call my name again. So, if you ever find yourself in a building that seems ordinary but hides a secret floor, one that doesn't appear on any official plan, take heed. Don't be tempted by curiosity or dread. For some floors are haunted by more than memories, they are haunted by the living echoes of sorrow, regret, and an unquenchable desire for release. And if you answer that call, you might find that you can never truly escape the grip of the past. That is my story. I share it not only as a record of what I endured but as a caution to anyone who might stumble upon a mystery too dark to be ignored. The 13th floor may be hidden from view, locked away by superstition and old fears, but its true power lies in the secrets it keeps, and the souls it ensnares. I hope that by telling this tale, I can offer a fragment of warning. Sometimes the unknown is better left unexplored, and some doors, once opened, demand a price you may not be ready to pay. I still live here in Mayfair Towers, and sometimes on stormy nights, when the power flickers and the wind howls, I can't help but glance at the elevator panel. I know that the past is never truly dead, and that deep in the heart of this old building, the 13th floor remains, a silent reminder of everything I encountered, and everything that still lingers in the shadows. I keep the journal and the old documents in a locked drawer, relics of a time when the building's secrets nearly consumed me. They serve as both a testament to what was done and a warning to those who might be tempted to follow the same path.